They say in the city that power is a language spoken in whispers and gunshots, a currency traded in fear. For 40 years, Kang Min-jun had been its most fluent speaker. His name was a shadow that fell over boardrooms and back alleys with equal weight, a silent testament to a life spent building an empire of secrets on a foundation of disciplined violence. But now, at 68, the empire felt like a gilded cage, and the loyalty he commanded was as thin and cold as the winter glass of his penthouse window. The men who bowed to him saw a throne, a legacy of assets to be carved up. They no longer saw the man, only the institution. And the man was tired. He was tired of the hungry wolves he had raised, their eyes gleaming with avarice, their smiles like polished knives. He was searching for something real, a single, solitary proof that the world had not been entirely consumed by its own greed. This search had led him here, to a greasy spoon diner called the Morning Star, a place so far beneath his world it might as well have been on another planet. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried onions. The vinyl on the booth seats was cracked, weeping yellow foam like old wounds. He wore the clothes of a forgotten man, a threadbare coat, worn trousers, and a face etched with a weariness that was not an act. For the first time in decades, no one knew his name. He was just an old man taking up a booth on a Tuesday afternoon, invisible. And that was the point of this strange, desperate pilgrimage. He wanted to see how the world treated a ghost. He watched the waitress. Her name tag read Lena. She was young, maybe 20, with skin the color of rich coffee and eyes that held a universe of exhaustion. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long hours and aching feet, yet there was a precision to her work, a quiet dignity in the way she wiped down a sticky table or refilled a salt shaker. She never stopped moving, a small, solitary planet orbiting a constellation of demanding customers and endless tasks. Min-jun watched her handle a belligerent customer who complained his toast was too brown, her voice low and even, a sliver of calm against his grating anger. She did not placate him with a false smile. She simply listened, nodded, and returned with a new plate. There was no subservience in her posture, only a profound, unshakable patience. It was the patience of a mountain, a resilience he had only ever seen in men who had survived prison or war. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. He ordered a black coffee, nothing more. She brought it to him on a thick, chipped ceramic mug, its weight familiar and grounding. She didn't try to make small talk. She saw him for what he appeared to be, an old man who wanted to be left alone with his thoughts. For an hour, he sat there, nursing the bitter coffee, observing the small, desperate drama of the diner. He saw Lena discreetly slip a bread roll into the bag of a homeless woman who only ordered water, her gesture so swift and subtle it was almost invisible. He saw her console another waitress who was crying softly by the kitchen doors, a gentle hand on her shoulder, a few whispered words. Each act was a small, quiet rebellion against the harshness of the world. These were not grand gestures designed to be seen, but instinctive acts of grace performed in the shadows. He had built his entire life on calculating every move, every word, every alliance. Her kindness was spontaneous, a currency she spent without expecting anything in return. It was a language he had long forgotten how to speak. When he was ready to leave, he placed a crumpled $10 bill on the table for his $2 coffee. On top of it, he deliberately, carefully, placed a $5 bill. A tip that was generous but not suspiciously so. It was a test. A small, petty test, but a significant one. He wanted to see what she would do. Would her quiet dignity waver? Would he see a flicker of gratitude? Or perhaps the subtle disappointment of a worker who knew her time was worth more? He walked out of the diner, the little bell above the door announcing his departure with a tinny, cheerful ring that felt entirely out of place. He didn't go far. He slid into the back of a black sedan parked across the street, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness. His driver, Mr. Cho, a man whose face was a mask of impassive loyalty, sat silently behind the wheel. "Anything, sir?" Cho asked, his voice a low rumble. Min-jun didn't answer. He just watched the diner door, waiting. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, but he felt a strange tension in his chest, a feeling he usually associated with a high-stakes negotiation or an impending betrayal. Through the rain-streaked window of the car, he watched Lena clear his table. She picked up the bills, her movements fluid and practiced. He saw her pause for a fraction of a second as she separated the 5 from the 10. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, trying to read the unreadable language of her posture. There was no change in her expression. No triumphant smile, no sigh of relief. She simply folded the bills and tucked them into the pocket of her apron with the same methodical grace she applied to everything else. Disappointment, sharp and sour, pricked at him. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps she was just another person playing a part, her kindness a well-honed tool for survival. He had seen it 1,000 times before. He sighed, a tired, rasping sound in the silent car. "Let's go, Cho," he said, his voice flat. But just as Cho's hand moved toward the ignition, the diner door swung open again. It was Lena. She was holding something in her hand, squinting into the gray, drizzling afternoon. She looked left, then right, her brow furrowed in concern. She wasn't wearing a jacket, and the thin fabric of her uniform was already darkening with rain. She spotted his car, the only idling vehicle on the block, and without hesitation, she started walking towards it. Minjun's heart gave a strange, unfamiliar lurch. "Hold on," he commanded Cho, his voice sharp. Lena approached the passenger side, her steps quick and determined. She hesitated for a moment before tapping lightly on the tinted window. Cho glanced at Minjun, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. Minjun gave a curt nod. The window slid down with a soft, electric whir. Lena peered in, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. She looked past Cho and directly at Minjun. The exhaustion was still in her eyes, but now it was overlaid with a genuine, unfeigned concern. "Sir," she said, her voice clear despite the drumming rain. "You forgot these." She held out a pair of worn, gray leather gloves. They were old and cheap, the kind of thing he'd bought at a thrift store for his disguise. They were worthless. He stared at the gloves, then back at her face. Raindrops clung to her eyelashes, and a stray curl had plastered itself to her cheek. She was getting soaked for a pair of gloves that weren't worth $1. "Why did you come out in the rain for these?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. He was genuinely bewildered. The tip was on the table. Their transaction was complete. Her duty was done. He had seen men in his own organization who wouldn't cross a room for him without a clear order and the promise of reward. This girl had run out into a downpour for a stranger's forgotten trifles. Lena offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but was genuine all the same. "It's cold out," she said simply, as if that were the only explanation necessary. "I saw your hands. They looked like they get cold easily." She wasn't looking at the expensive car or the silent, imposing driver. She was looking at him, the old man from the diner. He took the gloves from her outstretched hand. Her fingers were cold. "The tip I left," he pressed, needing to understand. "It wasn't very much. You didn't need to do this." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet confusion, as if he were speaking a foreign language. "The tip was fine, sir." "Thank you," she said, her tone polite but firm. "But this has nothing to do with that." She pulled her arms around herself, shivering slightly. "A person's dignity isn't measured by what's in their wallet. It's about looking out for each other. You needed your gloves. That's all." And with that, she gave a small nod, turned, and walked back to the diner, disappearing behind the door with another tinny jingle. Minjun sat in stunned silence, the cheap leather gloves feeling impossibly heavy in his hands. He had spent a lifetime building walls of steel and concrete, buying loyalty, commanding respect through fear. This young woman, with nothing to her name but tired feet and a threadbare uniform, had just shown him a strength he had never been able to purchase. It was a strength built not on power or wealth, but on a foundation of simple, unadorned decency. He looked at Mr. Cho, whose impassive face now held a flicker of understanding. "Sir?" Minjun didn't answer immediately. He stared at the diner, at the warm light spilling from its windows, a small beacon in the gray, dreary city. It suddenly seemed like the safest, most honest place in the world. "Find out everything about her," Minjun finally said, his voice quiet but filled with an absolute, unyielding authority. "Her name, her family, her dreams, her debts. Everything. I want to know every ghost that haunts her and every hope that keeps her standing." The car pulled away from the curb, its movements smooth and silent, a predator leaving the hunting ground. But for the first time in a very long time, Kang Min-jun didn't feel like a predator. He felt like a man who had just been handed a map to a treasure he never knew existed. Back in the sterile quiet of his penthouse, surrounded by priceless art and minimalist furniture that screamed wealth, the cheap diner gloves sat on a polished mahogany table, a stark and jarring anomaly. Mr. Cho stood before him, holding a thin file. The information had been gathered with the ruthless efficiency Min-jun expected. "Her name is Lena Washington," Cho reported, his voice a neutral monotone. 20 years old. An orphan, raised by her grandmother, who now resides in the St. Jude's assisted living facility. The facility's fees are substantial. Miss Washington works 60 hours a week at the diner and takes online classes at the city college at night. Her field of study is social work. She has no criminal record, no outstanding personal debts besides a small student loan. By all accounts, she is exactly what she appears to be. Min-jun picked up one of the gloves, running his thumb over the cracked leather. He thought of her words. A person's dignity isn't measured by what's in their wallet. The men in his circle measured everything by that metric. His lieutenants, his captains, even the son of his old partner, Jin-woo, a young man whose ambition was a barely concealed blade. They were all vultures circling his fortune. They spoke of loyalty and honor, but their eyes held only calculations. "She is a queen in a paper crown," Min-jun murmured, more to himself than to Cho. Cho remained silent, but a subtle shift in his posture betrayed his skepticism. "Sir, with respect, she is a waitress. A kind girl, perhaps, but she is of no strategic importance." Min-jun looked up, his gaze sharp enough to make Cho flinch. "You are wrong. Strategic importance is not always found on a balance sheet. Sometimes it is found in a person's soul. That girl possesses something that no one in our world has, an incorruptible core. That is more valuable than any asset we control." He knew then what he had to do. It was a plan so audacious, so contrary to a lifetime of cold logic, that it felt like madness. But it also felt like the only sane thing to do. He would not just help her. He would bring her into his world, not as a charity case, but as an anchor. He would make her the one thing no one could touch. He began visiting the diner every Tuesday. He always sat in Lena's section, always ordered the same black coffee. He shed the disguise of the impoverished old man, opting instead for the simple, well-tailored but unassuming clothes of a retired professor. He was quiet, polite, a fixture in her otherwise chaotic afternoon. Slowly, cautiously, he began to draw her out. He asked about her studies, and he listened, truly listened, as she spoke with quiet passion about her desire to help people who fell through the cracks of society. He learned about her grandmother, Eleanor, a woman she spoke of with a fierce, protective love that resonated with his own buried sense of family. He never spoke of his own life, his own world. To her, he was just Mr. Kang, a kind, lonely old gentleman who seemed to enjoy her company. He found himself looking forward to these weekly meetings, to the hour of peace he found in her presence. It was like drinking clean water after a lifetime of poison. But such a change in his routine did not go unnoticed. The wolves in his organization were always watching. The most observant of them was Park Jin-woo, a man whose polished exterior and charming smile concealed a heart of pure, cold ambition. Jin-woo saw Min-jun's weekly disappearances as a sign of encroaching senility, a weakness to be exploited. He had his own men follow the chairman. When they reported back about the diner, about the young black waitress, Jin-woo's mind went to the most obvious, cynical conclusion. The old man had a secret lover, a common girl he was doting on. This, to Jin-woo, was an insult to the organization and a threat to his own carefully laid plans to inherit the throne. He decided to handle the problem himself, to show the old man that his private sentimentality had consequences. One Tuesday, when Minjun was not there, two of Jinwoo's men swaggered into the diner. They were everything the diner was not. Loud, arrogant, dressed in designer clothes that looked garish under the fluorescent lights. They sat in Lena's section and began their performance. They were rude, demanding, and condescending. They sent food back, complained about imaginary hairs in their water, and made thinly veiled, lewd comments about her. Lena handled it with her usual unshakable calm, her face a mask of professional neutrality. But the men escalated, their voices growing louder, their actions more aggressive. One of them deliberately knocked a full glass of water onto the floor, then yelled at her for not cleaning it up fast enough. The other customers stared, a mixture of fear and discomfort silencing the room. The manager, a timid man named Frank, scurried over, wringing his hands. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Jinwoo's man sneered. "The problem is the service. And this one's attitude," he pointed a thick finger at Lena. "Maybe you should hire people who know their place." The threat was clear. They were trying to get her fired, to sever the connection she had with Minjun, to erase her from his life. Lena stood her ground, her chin held high, her eyes meeting the man's glare without flinching. "I apologize if the service was not to your satisfaction," she said, her voice steady. "I will bring your check," but as she turned, one of the men reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip tight and bruising. "We're not done with you yet," he growled, his face twisting into an ugly smirk. The air in the diner crackled with tension. Frank the manager turned pale, utterly useless. The other customers shrank back in their booths. Lena's composure finally cracked, a flicker of fear crossing her features as she tried to pull her arm away. Suddenly, the diner's front door swung open with such force that it slammed against the wall, the bell shrieking in protest. Two men stepped inside. They were not dressed in expensive suits, but in the quiet, functional attire of professionals. They moved with a silent, predatory grace that made Jinwoo's thugs look like clumsy amateurs. They were Mr. Cho's men, Minjun's personal guard, who had been posted discreetly outside the diner for weeks. The man holding Lena's arm looked up, his smirk faltering. The two newcomers ignored everyone else in the room. Their focus was entirely on the two thugs. One of them, a man with a scar bisecting his eyebrow, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod towards the door. The message was clear: take this outside. Jinwoo's men, recognizing a level of authority and danger far beyond their own, released Lena's arm as if it were red hot. They exchanged a nervous glance and, without another word, scrambled out of the booth and hurried out of the diner. The two newcomers followed them out, the door swinging shut behind them, leaving a stunned, silent room in their wake. Lena stood trembling, rubbing her arm where the man had grabbed her. The quiet of the diner was broken by the sound of a car door opening and then, a moment later, a sickening thud, followed by a choked gasp. Then silence. Through the front window, Lena saw the two thugs being unceremoniously bundled into a black van that sped away into the afternoon traffic. The entire incident had lasted less than a minute. Just as the collective breath of the diner was released, the door opened again. This time, it was Kong Minjun. He was no longer the gentle, retired professor. He was radiating an aura of cold, absolute power that seemed to suck the very warmth from the air. His eyes, usually soft when he looked at her, were now chips of obsidian. He walked directly to her, his gaze sweeping over her, noting her pale face and the red marks forming on her arm. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Lena could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. He looked around the diner, his gaze landing on the terrified manager. "My car is outside." "She is leaving with me," Minjun stated. It was not a request. It was a command that altered the laws of physics in a room. Frank the manager just nodded dumbly. Minjun gently placed a hand on Lena's back, guiding her out of the diner and into the cold, clean air. He led her to the black sedan, the same one from that first day. Mr. Cho held the door open for her. As she slid into the plush leather interior, the world of the greasy spoon diner, of sticky tables and the smell of fried food, felt a million miles away. Minjun got in beside her, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud that sealed them off from the outside world. The car pulled smoothly into traffic. For several minutes, they rode in silence. Lena stared out the window, her mind racing, trying to piece together the impossible events of the last hour. The kind old man, the menacing thugs, the silent, efficient men who had made them disappear. Those men, she finally whispered, finding her voice. Who were they? Minjun turned to face her. The hardness in his eyes had softened into a deep, profound regret. They were wolves, he said, his voice heavy. And they came to your door because of me. I am sorry, Lena. I never intended for my world to touch yours in such a violent way. I was trying to protect you, but my presence has instead put you in danger. Protect me? She asked, confused.
Why?
You're just Mr. Kong. A customer, he gave a sad, weary smile. That is who I wanted to be for you. But it is not who I am, he paused, as if weighing the immense gravity of his next words. My name is Kong Minjun. I am the head of an organization that the police would call a criminal enterprise. My associates would call it a family. I call it a burden. Those men were sent by someone who sees you as a threat to his position within that family. The confession hung in the air between them, more shocking than the violence she had just witnessed. A mafia boss. The gentle old man who discussed social work theories with her was a crime lord. Lena felt a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach, but beneath it, something else stirred, a strange, defiant clarity. She had been fighting her own quiet battles her whole life, against poverty, against exhaustion, against the world's indifference. This was just a different kind of monster. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw past the power and the danger to the deep loneliness in his eyes. He was a king on a barren island. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice surprisingly steady. He had expected fear, tears, accusations. He had not expected this quiet, direct strength. It affirmed everything he had seen in her from the very beginning. At first, I wanted to help you from a distance, he admitted. Pay for your grandmother's care anonymously. Fund your education. But I realized that money would not solve the real problem. The wolves in my life will not stop. As long as they perceive you as my weakness, they will come for you. The only way to protect you is not to hide you, but to give you power. To put you so high they can never reach you. The car was gliding through the city now, heading towards the gleaming towers of the financial district, a world of glass and steel she had only ever seen from afar. I can offer you a job, he continued. A position in one of my legitimate companies. A generous salary, security, a new life. You would never have to worry about money again. Lena was silent for a long moment, processing the offer. A way out. A chance to give her grandmother the best care, to finish her degree without killing herself working double shifts. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. But she thought of the men in the diner, of the casual brutality, of the darkness that swirled just beneath the surface of this man's life. No, she said softly, but with utter finality. Thank you for the offer, Mr. Kong, but no. I don't want your money. I don't want to be a part of your world, his breath hitched. He had offered her the gilded cage, and she had refused. Anyone else he had ever known would have leapt at the chance. Her refusal was the final proof he needed. It wasn't just kindness she possessed. It was an ironclad integrity. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and desperation. Then you leave me only one option, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He reached across the seat and gently took her hand. His own was warm, his touch surprisingly gentle. I am not offering you a job, Lena. I am offering you my name, my protection, my world. Not as an employee, but as my equal. I am asking you to marry me. Lena stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs. The proposition was so absurd, so outlandish, it felt like a line from a movie. Marry you? We barely know each other. You're the head of the Mafia. And I'm a waitress. You are the strongest person I have ever met, he corrected her, his gaze intense, unwavering. I am an old man, surrounded by liars and predators. I have wealth beyond measure, but I have no one I can trust. I have no heir worthy of the legacy I have built. Not the money, but the power. Power that, in the right hands, can be used to protect as well as destroy. I am not asking for a marriage of passion, but a marriage of alliance. An alliance of your light and my darkness. Stand by my side, and no one will ever dare to harm you or anyone you love again. I will give you a kingdom, Lena, not to rule, but to shelter. The car came to a stop in a private underground garage. The silence that followed his proposal was absolute. Lena pulled her hand away, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a strange, terrifying flicker of temptation. It wasn't the wealth or the power that tempted her, but the promise of safety. The promise of being able to protect her grandmother, to finally stop fighting a battle that was slowly grinding her down. I can't, she stammered, shaking her head. This is insane. Is it more insane than working yourself to the bone for a world that doesn't care if you live or die? He countered gently. Is it more insane than being at the mercy of men like the ones in the diner? Think about it. That is all I ask. He did not press her further. Mr. Cho escorted her to another, more modest car, which took her home to her small apartment. She spent the night staring at the ceiling, the old man's words echoing in her head. A marriage of alliance. A kingdom to shelter. It was a fairy tale twisted into a nightmare, or perhaps the other way around. She didn't give him an answer. In the days that followed, an unspoken truce seemed to settle. He didn't visit the diner. She tried to slip back into the rhythm of her old life, but it was impossible. The memory of the violence and the shocking proposal that followed had changed everything. She felt watched, not in a menacing way, but in a protective one. A quiet car was always parked down the street from her apartment building. A small problem with her landlord over a plumbing issue suddenly, miraculously, resolved itself. She knew it was his doing, his invisible hand shaping her world from a distance. Meanwhile, Jin-woo was seething. His attempt to remove the waitress had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. His men had been returned to him, bruised and terrified, with a stark warning to stay away from the diner. Jin-woo realized the girl was not a passing fancy. She was something far more significant to the old man. His spies within Minjun's inner circle reported the chairman's strange pronouncements about incorruptible souls and queens in paper crowns. Jin-woo knew he had to act decisively. If he couldn't get to Lena through direct intimidation, he would attack her where she was most vulnerable. He would go after her grandmother. Using his vast network of corrupt city officials, Jin-woo orchestrated a series of anonymous complaints against the St. Jude's assisted living facility. Suddenly, the home was buried in a mountain of bureaucratic red tape. Health inspectors arrived, citing dozens of fabricated, minor infractions. Fire marshals declared the building's wiring, which had been perfectly fine for 30 years, to be a critical hazard. The facility was hit with crippling fines and given an ultimatum: fix everything within 30 days or be shut down, its residents evicted. The administrator of the home, a decent but overwhelmed woman, called Lena in a panic. The cost of the mandated repairs was astronomical, far beyond their budget. They were going to be closed. Eleanor, her grandmother, would be out on the street. The news hit Lena like a physical blow. She knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was not a coincidence. This was an attack. It was a message, delivered not with fists, but with the cold, impersonal cruelty of bureaucracy. They were trying to break her, to force her to run. That night, a sleek, unmarked envelope was slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a single piece of paper with a typed message: disappear, and the problems for the old woman go away. Stay, and she will die in the gutter. The threat was bone-chillingly clear. Jin-woo had found her heart and put a knife to it. For a moment, despair washed over her. She could run. She could take her grandmother and disappear, live a life in hiding, always looking over her shoulder. But then, a different feeling began to burn through the fear, rage. A cold, hard anger she had never felt before. They had mistaken her kindness for weakness. They thought they could break her by threatening an old, sick woman. They had miscalculated. They had not seen the steel that lay beneath her quiet patience. She would not run. She would fight. But she couldn't fight them alone. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number Minjun had given her, a number she had sworn she would never use. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Kong," she said, her voice low and tight, devoid of any of its previous warmth. It was the voice of a soldier reporting for duty. "It's Lena. They're trying to shut down my grandmother's nursing home. They threatened her life if I don't disappear." There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. When Minjun finally spoke, his voice was terrifyingly calm, a quiet prelude to a hurricane. "Where are you?" "I'm at home," she replied. "Don't move. I'm coming to you. And Lena," he added, his voice dropping even lower, "you have my word. The man responsible for this will pay a price that will echo for a generation." He wasn't just coming to help her. He was coming to arm her. The battle had begun, and she had just chosen her side. She stood by the window, watching the city lights blur into a sea of indifferent stars. She was no longer just Lena Washington, the tired waitress. She was a woman who had been pushed too far, a queen who was about to claim her crown, not of paper, but of fire and iron. She thought of his proposal, and her answer was finally clear. "I accept," she whispered into the empty room. "I accept your offer, but not as your ward, as your partner. And our first order of business is to burn his world to the ground." The next evening, Kang Minjun called a formal assembly of his entire organization. These gatherings were rare, reserved only for moments of immense crisis or significant shifts in power. They met in the cavernous, echoing hall of a decommissioned warehouse on the waterfront, a place that had witnessed countless oaths of loyalty and sentences of death. The air was thick with tension and the smell of cold river water. His captains and lieutenants stood in rigid formation, their faces hard and unreadable, a gallery of men who lived by a brutal code. Park Jin-woo stood at the front, his expression a perfect blend of confidence and deference, betraying nothing of the scheme he had set in motion. He believed this meeting was about the chairman's failing health, perhaps even a prelude to his own ascension. He was wrong. The great steel doors groaned open, and Minjun walked in. But he was not alone. At his side, walking with a calm, regal poise that defied her simple black dress, was Lena. A collective murmur rippled through the room. The men stared, their eyes wide with disbelief and contempt. Who was this woman? This outsider? Jin-woo's confident smirk tightened into a thin, hard line. He saw her presence, not as a sign of his victory, but as the old man's final, pathetic act of defiance. Minjun led Lena to the head of the room, standing before them not as a weary elder, but as the formidable patriarch they all remembered and feared. His eyes swept over the assembly, cold and unforgiving. "For 40 years, I have led this family," he began, his voice booming in the vast space. "We have lived by a code of honor. We do not harm civilians. We do not terrorize the elderly. We do not use our strength to prey on the weak. That is what separates us from common street thugs." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. His gaze landed on Jin-woo. "One of you has forgotten this code," he gestured to Lena. "This is Lena Washington. Some of you have seen her as a distraction, a weakness. You are mistaken. She is the future of this family. Because she understands something that one of you has forgotten. True strength is not the ability to crush others, but the will to protect them." He then laid out Jin-woo's betrayal in cold, precise detail. He spoke of the thugs sent to the diner. He spoke of the corrupt officials, the fabricated violations, the threat against an innocent, elderly woman in a nursing home. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling Jin-woo's reputation piece by piece. As he spoke, Mr. Cho and his men handed out files to each of the captains. Inside was the proof: bank records, phone logs, sworn affidavits from the city officials Jin-woo had bribed, who had crumbled under Minjun's immense pressure. It was a case so airtight, so damning, that there was no room for denial. Jin-woo's face went from pale to ashen. The trap had been sprung, and he was the one caught in it. "These are lies," he blustered, his voice cracking. "The old man is senile. He's being manipulated by this whore." The moment the slur left his lips, the atmosphere in the room turned arctic. Before Minjun could even react, Lena took a step forward. All eyes turned to her. She was not intimidated by the room full of killers. Her gaze was fixed on Jinwoo, and it held not fear, but a profound, pitying contempt. "You call me a whore?" she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the hall. "I work 60 hours a week on my feet to pay for my grandmother's care and my own education. I have earned every dollar I have ever had. You," she said, her voice dropping, "you have inherited everything and earned nothing. You threaten old women from the shadows because you are a coward. You talk about strength, but you are the weakest man in this room." Her words, spoken with such quiet, unassailable truth, were more devastating than any physical attack. The men in the room, hard as they were, understood the difference between strength and bullying. They looked from the trembling, exposed Jinwoo to the unflinching young woman, and they saw what Minjun saw. They saw a spine of steel. Minjun raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "Park Jinwoo," he said, his voice a low, final judgment. "You have broken our code. You have betrayed our family. And you have brought shame upon the name of your father. You are no longer one of us." Jinwoo sank to his knees, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He had gambled for an empire and lost everything. The captains, his supposed allies, turned their backs on him. His fate was sealed. Mr. Cho and his men stepped forward and escorted the broken man away, his pleas for mercy echoing in the cavernous hall before being cut off by the heavy clang of the steel doors. Weeks later, the city skyline glittered outside the panoramic windows of Minjun's penthouse. The silence in the room was a comfortable one, broken only by the soft click of stones being placed on a go-board. Lena sat opposite Minjun, her expression focused as she contemplated her next move. She wore a simple silk blouse, a far cry from her diner uniform, but she wore it with the same unpretentious grace. She was a quick study, not just in the ancient game of strategy, but in the complex world she now inhabited. She had not become a gangster. Instead, she was becoming something far more powerful, the conscience of an empire. She managed the organization's legitimate charitable fronts, redirecting vast sums of money to community projects, shelters, and, of course, ensuring that St. Jude's and other facilities like it would never again be threatened by predatory bureaucracy. She wielded her newfound power with the same quiet decency she had wielded a coffee pot, and the men of the organization, from the highest captain to the lowest soldier, had come to respect her with a fierce, protective loyalty. Minjun watched her, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. He had not just found an heir. He had found a reason. He had spent his life accumulating power, and only now, in his final years, was he learning its true purpose from a 20-year-old girl who had run out into the rain for a pair of cheap gloves. He poured her a cup of tea. It was not from a delicate, priceless porcelain set. The cup he placed before her was a thick, heavy, white ceramic mug, the kind used for endless black coffee refills on a slow afternoon. "I bought the diner," he said, answering her unasked question. "The whole building, just to get a set of these." "To remind us." Lena looked up from the board, her dark eyes meeting his. She reached across the table, not to make a move, but to place her hand gently over his. It was a gesture of profound, quiet intimacy, a confirmation of their strange and powerful bond. It wasn't the fiery passion of a youthful romance, but something deeper, stronger. A partnership forged in mutual respect and a shared understanding of the world's darkness and the light one chooses to create within it. "A person's dignity," she said softly, finishing his thought, "is not measured in dollars." He nodded, his heart full. The city outside was a web of shadows and light, a kingdom he had once ruled with an iron fist. Now he had finally found its queen. Not a woman who craved a crown, but one who had worn an invisible one all along, a quiet testament to the unshakable truth that the greatest power in the world is not the kind you take, but the kind you give away, one small, decent act at a time.